In the mountains of western North Carolina stands a house that should not exist. It rises above the Blue Ridge Mountains like a fragment of Europe misplaced in the American wilderness. 250 rooms, 175,000 square feet, 65 fireplaces, a private railway spur cut directly into the hillside. It was the largest private residence ever built in the United States. No American has attempted anything comparable since. The reason is not a lack of money, ambition, or engineering ability. The reason is that the world which made this level of visible luxury possible was deliberately dismantled. Biltmore Estate was not simply a home. It was an argument made permanent. An argument that wealth should be visible, monumental, and unquestioned. That power deserved physical expression. That permanence could be purchased if one spent enough and built carefully enough. What followed in the 20th century did not eliminate extreme wealth. It taught wealth how to disappear. George Washington Vanderbilt II was born into a fortune so large it distorted ordinary language. His grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt, had built an empire of railroads and shipping lines that connected cities, controlled trade routes, and reshaped the American economy. By the time George inherited his share, the Vanderbilt family possessed resources that rivaled national governments. George did not build this fortune. He was shaped by it. Unlike his older brothers, George was not groomed to manage railroads or dominate boardrooms. He was smaller, quieter, and deeply introspective. He preferred books to factories, libraries to ledgers. He read obsessively, collected rare volumes, and surrounded himself with scholars. He traveled through Europe not as a tourist, but as a student, absorbing the rhythms of aristocratic life. He admired castles, chateaux, and country houses, not merely as displays of power, but as environments designed to cultivate intellect, order, and retreat. That belief would become the foundation of Biltmore. By the late 19th century, the American elite faced a crisis of environment. Cities like New York were swelling with immigrants, factories, noise, and pollution. Industrial wealth had created urban chaos. The old European solution to this problem was distance. Estates removed from the city, landscapes shaped to isolate power from the public. George Vanderbilt resolved to create such a refuge in America, but on a scale that matched the inheritance he carried. He purchased more than 100,000 acres near Asheville, North Carolina. The land was mountainous, heavily forested, and sparsely populated. It offered isolation, altitude, and control. Entire hillsides belonged to him. Rivers flowed through property he owned end to end. Here, he believed, he could build not just a house, but a complete world, insulated from the pressures reshaping the nation. To design it, he hired Richard Morris Hunt, the most prominent architect in the United States. Hunt had trained in Paris at the École des Beaux-Arts. He understood European grandeur and American ambition in equal measure. He also understood that Biltmore would not simply be judged as architecture, but as a statement. Together, Hunt and Vanderbilt conceived a French Renaissance chateau adapted to American scale, American resources, and American excess. Construction began in 1889. It would take 6 years, more than 1,000 workers, and an industrial operation rarely associated with private homes. Materials arrived by rail from across the continent and across the Atlantic. Indiana limestone for the exterior walls, tens of thousands of tons of steel for the internal skeleton, oak paneling hand-carved by craftsmen, stained glass designed by European artisans, 42,000 cubic yards of masonry laid piece by piece. At peak activity, the estate became a city of labor. Temporary villages housed stonecutters, carpenters, blacksmiths, masons, electricians, plumbers, and engineers. Entire workshops were constructed on site. Brickworks fired continuously. Sawmills processed timber from Vanderbilt's own forests. The house required not only workers, but systems to feed them, house them, and manage them. Biltmore was not built so much as operated into existence. The cost was approximately $6 million in the 1890s. Adjusted for modern currency, that exceeds $200 million. Even this figure understates the true expense, because it excludes land acquisition, infrastructure, and perpetual maintenance. Biltmore was not designed to be finished. It was designed to endure. Inside, the scale was overwhelming. a banquet hall 70 feet high with a triple-height ceiling and massive stone fireplace, a library holding more than 10,000 volumes, arranged on carved walnut shelves rising 3 stories, a winter garden beneath a vaulted glass ceiling, an indoor swimming pool, tiled in blue and white, heated year-round, a bowling alley, an innovation borrowed from European estates, electric lighting throughout the house at a time when most Americans still relied on gas or candles. The house was wired with servant call systems embedded in the walls, kitchens sprawled below ground, connected by service corridors invisible to guests. Food rose through dumbwaiters. Laundry facilities operated at industrial scale. Everything required choreography. Everything required labor. During peak seasons, more than 200 servants worked the estate. Cooks, maids, valets, gardeners, chauffeurs, mechanics, electricians, clerks, and foremen lived on site. Their quarters formed a parallel world beneath the fantasy above. Separate staircases allowed movement without crossing formal spaces. Separate entrances prevented interruption of illusion. The architecture enforced hierarchy as precisely as it enforced beauty. This invisible machinery was essential. Without it, Biltmore would collapse under its own weight. The elegance visitors admired was the surface of constant effort. George Vanderbilt moved into Biltmore on Christmas Eve in 1995. He was 33 years old. The house was not fully complete. It never would be. New projects continued indefinitely. Gardens expanded. Rooms were reworked. Systems upgraded. Completion was not the goal. Permanence was. Life at Biltmore followed a rhythm borrowed from European aristocracy. Mornings were quiet and disciplined. Afternoons were reserved for reading, horseback riding, forestry inspections, or agricultural experiments. Evenings brought formal dinners of multiple courses served in the banquet hall, followed by music, conversation, or private readings beneath chandeliers lit by hundreds of electric bulbs. Guests arrived by private train. Senators, industrialists, diplomats, writers, and social leaders passed through the estate. They marveled not only at the scale, but at the order. Everything appeared effortless. Everything worked. Biltmore presented wealth not as vulgar excess, but as cultivated authority. In 1898, George married Edith Stuyvesant Dresser. She was intelligent, practical, and socially adept. Where George retreated inward, Edith managed outward. Together, they attempted to transform Biltmore from a private monument into a living institution. They raised a daughter. They hosted charitable events. They invested heavily in forestry and agriculture, pioneering conservation practices decades before environmentalism became fashionable. Vanderbilt hired the landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted to reshape the surrounding land. Forests were managed scientifically. Farms were modernized. The estate became a demonstration of sustainable land use, long before the term existed. Biltmore was intended not only to display wealth, but to justify it. And yet, beneath this order, the foundations were shifting. The world outside Biltmore was changing faster than its owner understood. Industrial capitalism had produced fortunes at unprecedented speed, but it had also produced inequality on an unprecedented scale. Labor unrest spread through factories and railroads. Journalists exposed monopolies and corruption. Progressive politicians demanded reform. The idea that one family should command such visible wealth became politically dangerous. In 1913, the United States introduced a federal income tax. For the first time, extreme wealth could be systematically redistributed through law. Estate taxes followed. Public tolerance for aristocratic display collapsed. The economic logic that sustained estates like Biltmore was dismantled piece by piece. George Vanderbilt died in 1914 at the age of 51 from complications of appendicitis. His death was sudden and unceremonious. He did not live to see the full consequences of the world turning against the type of wealth he embodied. Edith inherited the estate and the burden that came with it. Within a decade, maintaining Biltmore became nearly impossible. Taxes alone consumed enormous portions of the family's income. Staff wages rose. Maintenance costs escalated. A house designed for abundance became a liability in scarcity. Edith made the decision that would define Biltmore's afterlife. She opened it to the public. In 1930, during the depths of the Great Depression, Biltmore Estate became a tourist attraction. The private retreat transformed into a public museum. Visitors paid admission to walk through rooms once reserved for the elite. The logic was stark. If the estate could no longer exist as a symbol of private power, it would survive as a commodity. This transformation saved the building. It also ended its original purpose. No American billionaire followed Vanderbilt's example. Mansions shrank. Wealth retreated into trusts, corporations, and financial instruments. Power learned discretion. The lesson was unmistakable. Visibility attracted regulation. Grandeur invited scrutiny. Monumental wealth became a liability. Today, the world's wealthiest individuals possess fortunes that dwarf Vanderbilt's by orders of magnitude. They could build 10 Biltmores without denting their net worth. They choose not to. Their homes are fortified, discreet, often anonymous. Their power expresses itself through ownership structures, political influence, and digital systems rather than stone and timber. Standing on the terrace at Biltmore today, looking across manicured lawns and distant mountains, visitors encounter a paradox. The house still stands because it changed. The fortune that built it could not. Biltmore proved something uncomfortable. Extreme wealth did not disappear. It adapted. It learned to hide. The mansion endures as a relic of a brief moment when power believed permanence could be purchased in architecture. That belief died with the world that allowed it. What replaced it was quieter, more efficient, and far harder to confront. Biltmore offers no judgment. It provides evidence. The question it leaves behind is whether invisibility is progress or simply a more sophisticated form of the same inequality. The building does not answer. It only stands. Those mechanisms did not arrive as a single blow. They advanced quietly, wrapped in policy language and moral arguments that reframed how power was allowed to exist in public. The Gilded Age had produced wealth too fast for the social order to absorb. The response was not revolution, but regulation. And regulation targeted what it could see. For decades, fortunes like the Vanderbilts had announced themselves openly. Railroad terminals bore their names. Mansions rose on avenues and hillsides. Wealth was loud because it could be. That visibility was precisely what made it vulnerable. Reformers argued that if power was visible, it could be taxed. If it could be taxed, it could be controlled. In 1913, the federal income tax became law. For the first time, extreme personal wealth faced a permanent mechanism of extraction. Estate taxes followed soon after, striking directly at the logic that had sustained dynastic properties. Large fortunes could still exist, but they would no longer pass intact from one generation to the next without cost. This shift was not abstract to Biltmore. The estate had been designed for a world without these pressures. Its scale assumed a permanent surplus. Its staff levels assumed endless liquidity. Its maintenance assumed a fortune that could absorb inefficiency. That assumption was now wrong. George Vanderbilt did not live to confront this reality. In 1914, at the age of 51, he died suddenly from complications of appendicitis. His death was not dramatic. There was no public reckoning, no symbolic collapse. He simply disappeared, leaving behind a house that required his fortune to justify its existence. Edith Vanderbilt inherited the estate along with the burden of sustaining it. She was capable, disciplined, and pragmatic, but the mathematics were unforgiving. Taxes increased, labor costs rose. The sheer expense of operating a structure of this size became impossible to disguise. Biltmore was no longer an expression of abundance. It was an economic problem. At the same time, the broader culture was turning. Public patience for visible excess evaporated during the years leading into the First World War. The language of sacrifice replaced the language of luxury. Wealth was expected to prove its usefulness or retreat from view. Biltmore could not retreat. It was too large to hide. By the 1920s, the estate was under strain. Edith began selling parcels of land to reduce tax exposure. Acreage that had once formed a protective buffer around the house was gradually released back into the public economy. What remained was still vast, but the direction was clear. The world that allowed Biltmore to exist unchanged was closing. Then came the Great Depression. As markets collapsed and unemployment spread, estates like Biltmore became politically radioactive. Maintaining a private palace while millions struggled for basic survival was no longer defensible. Edith faced a decision that would have been unthinkable to her husband. She opened the house to the public. In 1930, Biltmore Estate became a destination. Admission fees replaced private hospitality. Visitors arrived not as guests, but as customers. They walked through rooms designed for exclusivity, now arranged for observation. The transformation was total. This decision saved the building. It also ended its original meaning. Biltmore was no longer a retreat from society. It became an artifact of a society that had rejected the conditions that created it. The house survived by surrendering privacy, the very thing it had been built to guarantee. The shift had consequences far beyond Asheville. Other American elites watched closely. The lesson was unmistakable. Monumental visibility invited scrutiny. Scrutiny invited taxation. Taxation dismantled permanence. Those who wished to preserve power learned to redesign how it appeared. No American billionaire ever attempted another Biltmore. This absence was not a failure of imagination or capacity. Engineering advanced. Materials improved. Fortunes grew exponentially larger. The resources existed to build houses even more extravagant. What disappeared was the incentive. The logic of power had inverted. Where 19th century wealth announced itself through architecture, 20th century wealth learned discretion. It moved into corporate structures, foundations, trusts, and political influence. It became abstract, harder to photograph, harder to regulate. Biltmore thus became a boundary marker. On one side stood the age of visible wealth, confident in its permanence. On the other stood an era of concealed power, mobile and defensive. Inside the house, the consequences were visible in small ways. Entire wings closed to reduce heating costs. Staff numbers were reduced. Rooms once designed for daily use became museum spaces. Objects once handled casually were roped off and labeled. The living organism of the estate hardened into display. Yet the architecture resisted complete fossilization. The sheer quality of craftsmanship refused to degrade quietly. Stone walls held. Timber aged gracefully. The systems beneath the house continued to function with maintenance and care. Biltmore did not decay. It adapted. Visitors walking through the banquet hall no longer encountered dinners of 12 courses. They encountered silence. Footsteps echoed where orchestras once played. The space did not feel abandoned. It felt paused, as if waiting for a world that would not return. The transformation of Biltmore mirrored a broader psychological shift in how wealth related to space. The mansion had been built to prove permanence. Its survival depended on transformation. The contradiction was complete. By mid-century, the Vanderbilt name faded from public dominance. The fortune fragmented, influence dispersed. What remained was the house itself, operating as a hybrid of museum, tourist attraction, and historical document. The estate employed guides, curators, and conservators rather than valets and footmen. Knowledge replaced service. Preservation replaced display. The house became valuable, not because it housed power, but because it explained it. Biltmore began to function as evidence. Evidence of how wealth once behaved when it felt untouchable. Evidence of how architecture served as social argument. Evidence of what happens when the economic conditions that sustain excess are withdrawn. Outside the estate, the modern billionaire class was rising. Their fortunes dwarfed Vanderbilt's. Their reach was global, yet their physical footprints shrank. Instead of estates, they accumulated portfolios. Instead of palaces, they built networks. Homes became compounds, fortresses, or investments, often anonymous, often deliberately modest in appearance. Visibility became risk. Opacity became strategy. The contrast was stark. Biltmore stood as a visible mass of stone and timber, announcing its existence to anyone who approached. Modern wealth preferred distance, encryption, and mobility. This was not humility. It was adaptation. Standing in the library today, surrounded by thousands of volumes collected by a man who believed knowledge justified wealth, visitors confront a paradox. The ideals that built Biltmore were sincere. They were also unsustainable. Culture, refinement, and stewardship were not enough to protect visible power from a society that no longer accepted it. The house remains because it changed its relationship to the public. The fortune that built it could not. Biltmore's survival required surrendering the very privacy that had defined it. The gates opened. The staff became interpreters. The silence became educational. What was once hidden became explained. And yet, something lingered beneath the surface. Visitors and staff reported a strange quality to the interior spaces after hours. Not phenomena that could be cataloged or verified, but sensations. A feeling of scale pressing inward, corridors that seemed longer when empty, rooms that absorbed sound rather than reflecting it. These reports did not describe events. They described atmosphere. Perhaps this was simply architecture, behaving as architecture does when stripped of human activity. Or perhaps it was the psychological residue of a house built to contain one man's idea of permanence. Biltmore does not claim to be haunted. It does not trade in spectacle or folklore. It does not need to. The weight it carries is historical rather than supernatural. The unease comes not from ghosts, but from recognition. Recognition that the house represents an argument that lost. Recognition that power did not vanish when the argument failed. It changed tactics. As the 20th century progressed, the distance between wealth and visibility widened. What had once been announced through stone moved into paper, contracts, and digital abstractions. The monuments stopped rising. The influence did not. Biltmore remained, frozen between worlds, too large to be private, too specific to be replicated, too honest to be dismissed. It stood as proof that there was a moment when wealth believed it could build permanence, and proof that the belief was wrong. The question that followed was not whether such a house could be built again. It was why no one tried. And the answer lay not in architecture, but in the lessons learned from Biltmore's survival. That answer becomes clearer the longer one studies what replaced Biltmore rather than what followed it. The 20th century did not abolish extreme wealth. It perfected its ability to exist without leaving architectural fingerprints. Power learned that stone was a liability. Permanence invited attention. Attention invited regulation. And regulation eroded control. By the late 20th century, the idea of building a single monumental residence as a statement of status had become irrational. The risks were too obvious. Fixed assets could be taxed, photographed, protested, legislated against. Mobility offered protection. Complexity offered camouflage. Modern wealth reorganized itself accordingly. Influence shifted into corporate ownership structures that blurred responsibility. Foundations rebranded accumulation as philanthropy. Trusts fragmented inheritance into vehicles difficult to track or dismantle. Power became procedural rather than spatial. Against that background, Biltmore feels almost naive. It stands exposed, unhidden, unashamed. It announces exactly what it is and what it cost. There are no shell companies embedded in its walls, no offshore corridors beneath its floors. It is honest in a way modern power refuses to be. That honesty is precisely what makes it unsettling. Visitors walking through the house today are often struck not by extravagance alone, but by density. The rooms are large, but they are also heavy. Stone absorbs sound. Ceilings press downward with intention. The house does not feel expansive in the way modern luxury homes do. It feels enclosing, as if the architecture expects submission rather than comfort. This was not accidental. European aristocratic houses were designed to impose order on those inside them. Hierarchy was built into circulation. Power was reinforced through scale. The American version borrowed these techniques without the centuries of cultural acclamation that made them feel natural elsewhere. Biltmore demanded belief. Belief in permanence, belief in hierarchy, belief that wealth deserved spatial dominance. That belief did not survive. As decades passed, the estate became increasingly careful about how it presented itself. Restoration replaced reinvention, conservation replaced expansion. The goal was no longer to project authority, but to preserve evidence. Biltmore became a controlled memory rather than a living argument. The irony is unavoidable. The house that was built to withdraw from society now depends on society for its survival. Admission tickets, guided tours, educational programs, and hospitality services sustain what private wealth could not. The estate employs hundreds, not to serve a family, but to interpret one. This transformation softened the house, but it did not erase its original intent. The architecture still insists, the scale still confronts. The corridors still guide movement in ways that reveal who was meant to be seen and who was not. Even the gardens, carefully restored, carry this tension. Designed to appear natural, They required constant manipulation. Landscapes that look effortless were engineered relentlessly. The illusion of harmony depended on invisible labor. That pattern mirrors the larger story of wealth itself. What appears seamless is maintained by effort hidden from view. What appears inevitable is carefully constructed. Biltmore exposes that mechanism because it cannot conceal it. The servants' corridors still exist. The kitchens still reveal their scale. The infrastructure remains legible. Modern wealth learned from this exposure and corrected it. There is a reason contemporary elites prefer minimalist architecture. Simplicity hides complexity. Glass hides boundaries. Neutrality deflects scrutiny. Biltmore does the opposite. It declares its boundaries. It marks its hierarchies. It invites judgment. That invitation is what makes it valuable today. The house no longer competes with modern luxury. It competes with modern amnesia. It reminds visitors that power once believed visibility was strength. It demonstrates the cost of that belief. Walking through the estate after hours, when visitors have left and the house returns to stillness, the effect changes. The rooms no longer feel performative. Without people, the scale becomes introspective. Sound dies quickly. Light settles unevenly. The house does not feel alive, but it does not feel dead either. Staff members often describe a sense of compression rather than fear, a feeling that the house was built to contain more certainty than history allowed. Corridors stretch longer than expected. Staircases feel narrower when empty. These are not stories of apparitions. They are stories of architecture behaving exactly as it was designed to. The house was meant to discipline those inside it. Without a family to discipline, the discipline turns inward. If there is a haunting at Biltmore, it is not supernatural. It is ideological. The haunting is the persistence of a worldview that failed but was never fully refuted. The belief that enough money could stabilize history. That culture could be insulated. That permanence was purchasable. Biltmore answers that belief without words. It survived by abandoning its purpose. It endures because it surrendered privacy, control, and exclusivity. The moment it ceased to function as a fortress of wealth, it became acceptable to preserve. That trade-off defines the modern relationship between power and visibility. Power survives by avoiding architecture. Architecture survives by renouncing power. This is why no equivalent has been built since. Not because modern billionaires lack ambition, but because they learned the wrong lesson would be obvious. A house like Biltmore would announce vulnerability. It would invite classification, taxation, and resistance. The modern equivalent of Biltmore is not a mansion. It is a balance sheet, a data center, a political network, an algorithm. These structures do not photograph well. They do not host tours. They do not stand on hillsides announcing their presence. They are far more effective. Standing on the terrace today, looking across the Blue Ridge Mountains as George Vanderbilt once did, visitors see a landscape that appears timeless. The mountains remain. The house remains. What changed was the logic that justified their union. Biltmore was built at the precise moment when private wealth reached its most visible peak. It stands because that peak was followed by retreat rather than repetition. The building proves that extreme wealth did not disappear. It evolved. It learned to become lighter, faster, and less accountable. The stone stayed behind. That is the quiet power of Biltmore now. It does not celebrate wealth. It documents its transformation. It shows what was lost, what was learned, and what was deliberately concealed. The house endures not as a model to follow, but as a boundary not crossed again. Whether that represents moral progress or simply strategic refinement remains unresolved. The estate offers no verdict. It only preserves the evidence. In that sense, Biltmore is not a relic of excess. It is a warning written in limestone.